Welcome to Bombast. Today we are joined by two distinguished experts, Professor Mohammad Sahimi, an authority on Iranian politics, and Ambassador John Limbert, veteran U.S. diplomat and Iran specialist, to unpack what may be one of the most consequential moments in the Islamic Republic's history. Across multiple lines of pressure, from domestic unrest to international sanctions and geopolitical isolation, Iran's political system appears to be facing intensifying strain. On the international front, Spain and other EU states are weighing expanded sanctions on Iran, including a push to designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps as a terrorist organization, a move that could reshape diplomatic engagement and economic ties. On the domestic front, the latest analysis in the Atlantic frames the regimes not as a traditional social contract, but as a predatory lease that has now expired, unpinning the mass protests and deep disillusionment within the Iranian society. From the domestic political analysis, Iranian analysts question whether the Islamic Republic's current structure, built on ideological legitimacy and security sector dominance, is prepared for a political, economical, and social crossroads it now confronts. And according to the Financial Times, the IRGC has paradoxically become both the guarantor of the regime's survival and the most consequential force shaping whatever political transition may lie ahead. These developments raise urgent questions. What dynamics are driving regime resilience or fragility? How should the US and its allies calibrate sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and support for civil society? And what is the realistic trajectory of Iran's governance and regional behavior? With us today to discuss these issues are Professor Sahimi and Ambassador Dr. Limbert. I start my question with Professor Sahimi. Fundamentals of the crisis, if we want to focus on them, many analysts now describe Iran's political order as operating under what the Atlantic calls a predatory contract rather than a social contract. How useful is this framing for understanding the current dynamics between state and society? What, in your view, has broken down structurally in the post-1979 system?
Let me first express my appreciation for being in this conversation with Ambassador Limbert, whom I have admired for many years. Well, the description that was published in the Atlantic is correct to a large extent. We all know that Iran's economy is run by several what people usually refer to as mafias. And in every aspect of the economy, we have these mafias operating. But at the same time, we have to remember that most of these mafia groups that are running the economy or controlling the economy risen to power and gain economic power as a direct result of US economic sanctions. Under the name of getting around the economic sanctions by the United States, many groups formed alliances and claimed that they can get around the economic sanctions. And that gave rise during the Mahmoud Ahmadinejad administration to these mafia groups that were trying to supposedly sell Iran's oil in the international markets and return the proceeds to Iran. But that didn't happen. And what we now know that these groups are so strong and so powerful that they can even, as they say in Iran, they can even buy the government. So the description to a large extent is correct, but with the caveat that we have to remember that one cause of this rise of mafia groups in Iran's economy is US economic sanctions. And if we didn't have these economic sanctions, it is quite possible that we would not be in this situation. I'll give you an example. During the time that the Rouhani administration was negotiating with the United States and limited sanctions had been lifted, Iran's economy began to grow. And in fact, in the first year after JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, was put in place, and both sides started implementing, Iran's economy grew by about 7.5%. And there was hope among Iranian people that opening the door of the country to outside investors would improve their lives. And in fact, after Trump exited from JCPOA, the New York Times had a very detailed report from Tehran saying that a lot of Iranian young people who had started startup companies through internet and were trying to establish relations with their European counterparts are totally disillusioned and disappointed because the sanctions have returned. So the description, as we all know, that Iran's economy to a large extent is run by mafia is correct, but we also have to keep in mind that at least one main cause of it is U.S. sanctions. What we can do is very difficult to imagine at this point, because the country is at the most critical period of its contemporary history. We have never been in a situation like that, where Iran is surrounded by hostile forces, and radical forces within Iran are also trying to push the country in a certain dangerous direction. So it is very difficult to imagine at this point what we can do. But if there was serious determination in order to address this, we must start with eliminating these mafias. And one part of it is to get all the companies that have links with various organs of the government, various organs in the Iran economy, but are not under the Pezeshkian administration, to bring them under Pezeshkian administration, under control of Pezeshkian administration, and start addressing this question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sahimi. I have to say I'm very cynical about that. I think we're past that point now, and it's an existential tug of war between the regime and the majority discontent public. But we will come back to you. Ambassador Limbert, Europe is divided on listing the IRGC as a terrorist organization, balancing punitive measures with diplomatic engagement. How do you assess the policy calculus in Brussels and Madrid on this question? What are the potential diplomatic risks and rewards of such a designation, especially considering that Spain was one of the most opposed to enlisting the IRGC as a terrorist organization, and now it is on board following the bloody crackdown in Iran? How do you think, such a designation would go down?
That's a good question. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be with Dr. Sahimi and to hear his very wise counsel that he has. No, the problem has always been with sanctions. I mean, one is what Dr. Sahimi mentioned about encouraging the predators at the expense of the prey. And for the United States, unfortunately, I have found in our policy circles, when I was in the government and as an observer, sanctions have become an end in themselves. No one seems to ask, what are we seeking to accomplish by these sanctions? We do these sanctions because they make us feel good. I'm not sure why. Do they help? And what is the goal? What is their goal? For example, back when the JCPOA was signed, I remember the administration claimed that it was the sanctions that deserved the credit for it. But it was like a student. To me, it was like a student taking an exam and grading his own exam and giving himself top marks. You said, "Yeah, our policy succeeded." You see, and they didn't look at other things. Now, I think what you pointed out, and there are other voices, both in the United States and in other countries, that say, yes, we don't like the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic is predatory, is brutal, is inefficient, is oppressive. All of these things. But is it that different? Do we deal that differently from the way we deal with other governments around the world, which carry on similar policies? I mean, we manage the United States and other countries. We manage to carry on relations with all kinds of systems. Now, what is the Islamic Republic different? And I think the argument has always been that we have interests that are maybe better served by some kind of engagement with the full knowledge that this is a very repressive and brutal and ugly regime. Now, it's possible. Now, what you say, however, is the recent events where this government has shown what it's willing to do, and how far it's willing to go against its own people, just to stay in power, just to keep their power and privileges, has perhaps changed the equation, and it said, no, we can't. We can't deal with this. I mean, you mentioned the Revolutionary Guard Corps, for example. Well, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, that's a huge organization, and there are a lot of ordinary Iranians who work for companies, groups, areas run by the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Do you want to throw those people out of work? Do you want somebody who works in some office somewhere that is attached to the Revolutionary Guard? Do you want his life to become, that person's life to become more difficult? Do you want it so he cannot feed his family? In other words, question of purpose, there's question of purpose, question of goal. But it's perhaps, and I hate to say that, I hate to say this, but the regime there, or what they like to call the nizam, the system, has pushed it to the wall, and said, at this point, there's no choice, because this is this is hopeless, and the only way of getting at this is to weaken the very apparatus which is keeping this regime in power. That's maybe again, that would for some of our European friends who have pushed, and I think pushed constructively sometimes for engagement. That may be the new thinking.
Professor Sahimi, going back to the economic drivers that Ambassador Limbert referred to what extent have economic conditions, inflation, currency collapse, shortages, transformed political protests into a broader legitimacy crisis in Iran? And how does the current cycle differ from previous protest waves like 2019 and 2022?
Well, first, let me respond to what you said at the end of what I had to say. I totally agree with you. I am also totally pessimistic that anything like what I suggested would happen under the current regime. But what I was referring to was, suppose that tomorrow we wake up and the present regime has disappeared and the new government is in power. That government still has to deal with the current situation. And the current situation is that a major part of the economy is run by several mafias. And therefore, those mafias somehow have to be eliminated and kicked out of the economy. That was what I was referring to. Basically, I am totally hopeless in terms of whether this current regime can take any meaningful, deep, and irreversible reforms to take Iran in a better direction. Regarding your question, the demonstrations started with economic demands. And in fact, to some extent, the government or the regime recognized it. President Pezeshkian met with the Bazaris where the demonstration began. The supreme leader also said that they are right to complain. The internet wasn't disconnected. Even the voices and vision of the Islamic Republic, the national network of television and radio, broadcast some of demonstrations. So there seemed to be moving in a certain direction where the government may have conceded some points and may have helped some people. But then what happened was during those demonstrations, external factors came into play. And those external factors were driven by Israel-supported mass media outside Iran, the social networks, and what happened in Venezuela. In Venezuela, what happened was that the Trump administration basically went into the country and kidnapped the legal president of the country and brought it to the United States. At the same time, President Trump threatened the regime in Tehran that if you open fire on people, we will also respond. At the same time, the monarchies have claimed that they have what they call the Eternal Guard, which was basically a ridiculous imitation of what Shah Mohammad Pahlavi had with his Eternal Guard, claiming that if people come out into the streets and demonstrate, both Trump and the Eternal Guard will protect them. So all of it put together gave rise to the bloody events of almost 2 weeks ago, where several thousand people got killed. So the driver at the beginning was the economy, the terrible state of economy. But then it was transformed into something broader. One of the differences this time was that in those 2 days where mass killing took place, the middle class came out. Because in the demonstrations that we had before, for example, in 1998 and 2000, the middle class stayed silent. This time, the middle class came out, and that became even more important because the middle class in Iran has always been a driving force for reform, for better governance, and so on. When the middle class came out, it also changed to some extent the nature of demonstrations. Although most of the people who lost their lives were from poorer people, but the middle class had a strong presence in those demonstrations, particularly in the last 2 days. So that's another difference that we see between these demonstrations and what happened in the past. In addition, 3 years ago, the demonstrations were about civil rights, about women's rights, about the freedom that Iranian youth want to have. And for that reason, when these demonstrations started, to a large extent, women stayed out of the demonstrations. But so that was another reason. But these demonstrations started with economic demand, and then through the factors that I enumerated for you, was transformed into something much bigger. In other words, what started with economic demand targeted the very existence of the regime itself. And the regime, obviously, is willing to go to any extent to stay in power. And that's the reason. And there were signs before the mass killing that the regime would respond like that. Because, for example, during those demonstrations, when it hadn't become bloody, the supreme leader appointed Brigadier General Ahmad Wahidi, who is well known as one of the most hardline IRGC officers, as deputy chief of staff of IRG High Command. And it was obvious that movement was basically a preparation for what may come after this. And just a few days before the mass killing, the army issued a statement. The same army that had stayed silent for decades issued a statement saying that they will protect, with whatever they have in power, the achievement of the Islamic Revolution of 1979. So that also indicated that the government would react very strongly to any possible demonstrations that was supposedly coming. So all of these show that the nature of the demonstration, especially the last 2-3 days of it, where mass killing happened, is totally different from what we had before.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sahimi. I would come back to you, but before I do that, and before I go to Ambassador Limbert, I would like you to think about this question. You said the regime is prepared to go to any length to keep itself in power. Before all of this broke out, before the riots, before the 12-day war, after the 12-day war, many analysts, including myself, I think even yourself, in different interviews, made it clear to the regime that the regime can either stand behind the oligarchs, the people who are squandering Iranian oil money to an extent that economy is drying up, or it can continue to rule. But the regime and Ayatollah Khamenei decided to stand with the oligarchs. They decided to increase the value of the dollar and decrease the value of the rial, hence imposing immense inflation on the economy and creating huge financial economics for the bazaar, who could not purchase the commodities that they were selling because of the price change. This is a very conscious decision by the regime to stand by the oligarchs who are draining the Iranian economy dry, and its willingness to basically kill and call the general public. So I think if you could consider that before I come back to you, Ambassador Limbert, if we want to go back to regional security implications, how might a possible US strike on Iran, which seems to be brewing and becoming more likely by the minute, affect Iran's regional behavior, especially in Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen, given the IRGC's footprint there?
Well, first of all, this, in general, and my experience has been that political problems and social dislocations are not solved by the military. You just turn on your television and look at Minneapolis, and look at what's happening in our own country. To know that this is not hard. This is not hard. Yes, military strike. Our militaries and militaries are very good at blowing things up. What they are not good at is dealing with the kind of situations that you have described. How are you going to get out of it? And if someone thinks, if someone wishes for Donald Trump to send the U.S. military in to solve all of Iran's problems, I'll just quote the English proverb, which is "Be careful what you wish for, because you may get it." And my personal experience in Iraq back in 2000, back in the early 2000s, and our experience in Afghanistan, it's not going to solve. It's not going to solve what is a basic problem, which is the Iranians are going to have to solve for them. Our Iranian friends need to solve for themselves. If they think foreigners are going to do it, just look at history. History of foreign intervention in Iran, whether by the U.S. or by anybody else, has never ended well. It certainly never ended well for our Iranian friends. Regionally, Iran has found itself back where it has been for most of the last 45 years, which is without friends, having made gratuitous enemies left and right. I mean, its friends were never much to begin with. I mean, maybe a failed state in Syria, a failed state in Lebanon, Armenia, half of Yemen, a failed state in Yemen, and so forth, and so forth and so on. But now it is has even fewer. And this again has been a long time debate among Iranians. Do we just go around making enemies of everybody, even those who want normal relations with us, or do we in fact, as we should, as our national interests dictate, do we talk to other countries like Saudi Arabia, for example? And it's gone back and forth. But a U.S. military strike what is it going to do? What's the aim? I would ask our policymakers, and not that they particularly listen to me, or I'm not sure who they listen to, or who President Trump listens to, but what's the goal? What do they want? What do they expect? What do they expect to get out of it? Is it more than a feel-good exercise? And ask the Iranians, how far do you want to go in provoking other powers into starting some needless conflict, to bring needless suffering? Oh, maybe they can hide in their underground bunkers. Although I must say the Israelis are pretty good at finding these people. But for the most part, the victims of these kinds of events are almost always ordinary people who want nothing more than to live their to live decent lives. So I don't see, I don't know if it's going to happen. President Trump ran on a platform which was very effective for him, which was no stupid wars. Particularly no stupid wars in the Middle East. And he excoriated the Bushes over the war, the disaster in Iraq that they brought on, and it was a winner for him. I mean, I'm not a big fan of the president, but in this case, I think he was right. But again, this seems to go back on what he's saying, and it goes back against what had been a winning political issue for him.
Absolutely. But I think he has kind of burnt his bridges, the bridges behind him, by emphasizing time and again, even this morning, that he's adamant to force the Iranian regime into making huge concessions, or they will be met with military might, even this morning. So I don't know whether
you never know. You never know. I mean, he says something today, and he'll say something else to me.
yes, that's true. That's absolutely
He'll something else tomorrow. If he really wanted to help, the first thing he would do is stop deporting Iranian asylum seekers. Because that's what he's got. That's what he has his goons from ICE doing, is sending asylum seekers who are forced, because of all the conditions that we've been discussing, we're forced to flee their homeland, which they love. I mean, my Iranian friends love their homeland. They don't do this by choice, and they're here for a better life. They're here for a decent life. They're here for a decent life, as many came before, and as many people, both of us know, all of us know, did so. But to send them back to an Islamic Republic that's going to imprison them, torture them, murder them, I don't see how that corresponds with saying help is on the way.
Absolutely, yes. That is absolutely crazy. I mean, they sent a plane back to Iran only the other day, 150. And this is the second plane they're sending back to Iran, which is currently, in huge unrest, and the regime is cracking down on protesters and dissidents. And I think this goes against every international norm.
It's a travesty.
It is. Dr. Sahimi, going back to my question, which I raised before.
Let me respond to your question.
Yes.
While Ambassador Limbert was speaking, I thought about your question. You see, I don't have any differences with you about the cause of what has transpired in the last 3 weeks. Yes, if you remember, right after Israeli attack on Iran, I was in your program, and I said that given how Iranian people responded to Israeli attack, because Israel was hopeful that by attacking Iran, Iranian people will pour into a street and demonstrate and topple the regime, and that didn't happen. And in fact, a lot of people condemn Israeli attacks on Iran. So at that time, I said, given what Iranian people have done, it is the time for regime to decide whether it wants to continue business as usual or take concrete steps towards Iranian people by releasing political prisoners, by removing censorship, by holding new completely free elections, by changing the leadership at the national network of radio and television so that every segment of the society can have its own voice, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, the regime didn't do it, because the way this regime behaves is that when the times are tough, they say, well, this is not the time to take reform. And then the tough time passes, they feel like they're victorious, and they say, well, we won, and therefore there is no need for reform. So there is no question that what has happened is the product of the regime's working. And we all know what happened. The regime sided with, as you said, with oligarchs, and without thinking about the inflationary effects that its step were going to create, suddenly everything jumped. The price of everything jumped by 50%, 100%, 30%, and so on. And even the bazaar that had traditionally been a silent or active partner with the government from the Iranian Revolution until now had to protest. So it was obvious that this is the product of the regime itself. It had nothing to do with Iranian. But what I was saying is that the demonstrations started with economic demand as a result of what the government had done, and then transformed into something much bigger. And the net result was that the mass killing the last 2-3 days of the demonstration. We don't even know how many people have actually lost their lives. There are all sorts of estimates from a few thousand to tens of thousands. So we don't even know that. And since yesterday, as I'm sure you know, the internet has opened up so you can connect to Iranian website inside Iran, and they're completely silent about what has happened. So it's obvious that there is this environment of severe repression, not allowing anybody to say anything. So regarding your question, I have no difference with you. I totally agree with what you said. But you asked me the question of what is the difference between this series of demonstration and in the past, and I said that the difference is that it started economic demand, but then transformed into a bigger one, whereas the demonstration of 3 years ago was over social rights, civil rights, and so on. So that was the difference between the two.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sahimi. We only have time for one question from each of the distinguished guests. I go to Ambassador Limbert. Ambassador, if we talk about successor leadership scenarios in Iran, how do external policymakers think about the succession planning in Iran? What are the strategic considerations if the clerical hierarchy collapses, or if the IRGC emerges as the current or central power broker?
That's a good question, because I've talked about this. Many of my Iranian friends and relatives have talked about this, and they're worried. This is very worrisome for them, because many of them, being at my age at least, people of my age, remember 1979 and the hopes that people had for a more open and humane society after the monarchy. And instead, they ended up with something worse, and something more brutal and more inefficient. As a result, now it's estimated 1 Iranian in 15 lives outside the country. This is not something Iranians did before. They left maybe ones and twos, but you never had anything like the mass emigration that you have now. So what follows? What followed 1979 was an orgy of retribution and revenge. And I think those people in power now, they're a little bit like, Sadi's famous cornered cat. Changol darare chishmi palangro. With its little claws, it takes out the eyes of a leopard. They're cornered, and they know it, and they can't put up with even the smallest protest, the smallest objection, because they know. And the problem, it seems to me, is you have maybe 20%, the same, like 20% of the population that voted for Jalili in the last election, Ali Jalili in the last election. they're part of the system. They're maybe in the various organs of the state. They've benefited from it. It's given them it's given them position, it's given them modicum position, and they know that if this system collapses, yeah, 1,000 people maybe can take their gold bars and run somewhere to Moscow or elsewhere, but the rest of them are going to be left behind to face the retribution and revenge of some very angry people whom they have lorded it over for 47 years. And, is truth and reconciliation in the cards? I know that Prince Reza, the Crown Prince, talks about truth and reconciliation, but judging by historical precedents, I'm not sure. I'd like to believe it would happen, but the historical precedents aren't very good. And so what we might see is, this system with all its faults is gone, but what comes along? Is it going to be any less brutal, any less difficult? Is the life of ordinary people going to be any better? At least this, you could say about this system, it's the devil people know, and people, a lot of people at least have learned to live with it. They drink and do their music in private, as Iranians have done for 1,000 years. Something else comes along, could be much worse, and I think a lot of people are worried about that. Certainly, a number of my friends and relatives talk about this a lot.
I completely agree with you, Ambassador Limbert, with just one caveat. I think the regime itself has at every choice decided to do the worst thing, which would lead to instability and lead to unavoidable confrontation. It seems to me that there's a regime which has a death wish. Everything it does appears to be aimed at bringing itself down. Everything that Khamenei says is just throwing salt on the wounds of the Iranian public, and whatever he does, and the entire regime.
They're obviously afraid. They're terrified, and they're
But why don't
terrified
they do the right thing?
terrified of because if they do the right thing, they're gone.
Yes,
I think that's what they feel. If they give just a little bit, they give just a little bit. I think that's the fear, that they're gone, they're gone, and those who remain behind are going to face a terrible retribution from their own people.
Yes, that's a very, very important.
Who are going to look for revenge for what they've suffered for the last 47 years.
Dr. Sahimi, based on your research and your work, what scenarios do you find most plausible over the next 6 to 12 months? Incremental adaptation, or authoritarian stabilization, or systematic breakdown?
Very difficult question to answer, although it's an excellent question. It all depends on whether the United States attacks Iran, and if it attacks, to what extent it attacks. If it attacks to topple the regime, I don't believe it. Bombing Iran, you can topple the regime. So I would say that in that scenario, the most plausible scenario would be the IRGC taking power and eliminate every other force or every other faction and take total control. If the United States does not attack Iran, then we have a different situation. I am hoping, with utter hopelessness, I am still hoping that internally there would be some movement, at least, towards people taking, even if there are minimal steps, they take some steps so that it would give people some hope for the future. We all know what happened over the past three or so weeks. Mass killing happened. But one of the net results of these mass killings and what transpired during the past 3 weeks, in my view, is that the Iranian people should recognize that they should take control of their own fate and not listen to outside forces. The outside forces are after their own interests. The outside forces there is no guarantee, as Ambassador Limbert said, that they can form a government or a system or a regime that is any better than the Islamic Republic. In fact, the way, for example, monarchists talk about future of Iran, it only implies that if they ever come to power, it would be a bloody civil war of revenge and killing because of what has happened to them over the past 50 years. So at least in this sense, I'm hoping that Iranian people, as painful as it has been because of the mass killing, because of losing their loved one, because of what has happened, learn this lesson. The lesson is we have to take control of our fate. We have to take control of country without listening to outside forces. I am totally opposed to any intervention in Iran by any power, no matter how good intention it might be, although I don't see any good intention on the part of the United States. But even if it is totally good intention, I don't see that will lead Iran to a better future. All we have to do is to look at Iran's neighbor. Look at Afghanistan. Look at Iraq. A little farther, look at Libya. Look at Syria. Look at Yemen. Look at Lebanon. Look at Sudan. Look at Somalia. We all know what has happened, and all of them has been the result of outside intervention. So we have to set aside any hope for the thinking that outside forces can come and make everything right. No, it will not happen. We have to take control of our own fate. We have to reject any outside interference. The way to do it is to have a national movement under a civilian leadership by known figures in Iran that are respected by Iranian people. We don't have any lack of respected Iranian patriots within Iran. We have many of them. Some of them are in silence, some of them are in jail, but we do have these people. Even outside Iran, we have very respectable figures. For example, Ms. Parastu Frouhar. She has proven that she is a truly nationalist Iranian. She protested the support of Israel, support of Germany for Israel during the war of aggression against Iran. She has always talked about human rights and has always remained loyal to Iran's national interests. So both outside Iran and inside Iran, we do have people that are respected by Iranian people, and therefore we don't need any outside intervention. We just have to take control of our own fate. We just have to push for a better future, and we can do it under the leadership that exists both in Iran and outside Iran, such as Parastu Frouhar and Dr. Ali Reza Rajai and figures like that. We don't need to go back to a dictatorship that Iranian people overthrown 50 years ago. It would be ridiculous to go back to go from a secular dictatorship to a religious dictatorship and then go back again to the same fascist secular dictatorship. We don't need that. So the scenario all depends on whether U.S. attacks Iran or not. If the U.S. attacks Iran, I think IRGC will take over. If it doesn't, then it all depends on Iranian people, and I'm hoping that some positive lessons will come out of what has happened.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I was going to end the program right now, but I have to say this, in the examples that you referred to, Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, Libya, it wasn't some sort of utopian, brothership in any of these countries. These were hellholes even before the US or international forces intervened. Just look at the first rule of Taliban in Afghanistan. It was the manifestation of hell on planet Earth. It was the nesting ground for anything related to any sort of terrorism in the globe. You had such a festering growth space from Al Qaeda to any other organization there. So I don't think we can push every evil in the world on US intervention. These places were really run down, really badly governed. They were areas of huge inhumane treatment of the people, stoning, torture, disappearances, everything. Okay, so it wasn't like the US came in and we had such a civil society in Afghanistan and the US destroyed it and threw it out of the window.
Mr. Manzarpour, you are correct, but it seems to me that the history that you start is the fall of 2001. The history did not start in fall of 2001 when George Bush administration invaded Afghanistan. If you want to look at the misery of Afghan people, if you want to look at the terrible fate that they have had, you have to go back to 1970s when a leftist progressive government overthrew the monarchy in Afghanistan, put in some reforms, and then the US, in response to it, created the Mujahideen to fight with the leftist government, and it's supported in the Soviet Union and involved the country in a 10-year war. Okay, that's history does not start in fall of 2001.
I
No.
agree with you, Dr. Sahimi. I totally agree with you. But the
And
Mujahideen were also
let me finish.
Afghans.
Let me finish. Yes, Afghanistan was a terrible country when US invaded. Okay, there is no question about it. The Clinton administration, after the Taliban came to power in 1996, wanted to establish diplomatic relation with Afghanistan. In fact, when Taliban took over Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, a State Department spokesman said, we interpret this as a positive term for the Afghan people. The only thing that prevented establishing political relation between Clinton administration and Afghanistan was the fact that Afghan people, the Taliban started to treat women very terribly. And of course, Madeleine Albright, a woman as a Secretary of State, was ashamed of moving forward with establishing the relation. So there is no question that Afghanistan was a terrible country. The regime was a terrible country. But did U.S. intervention in Afghanistan made any positive changes in that country? No, it didn't. It occupied the country for 20 years. For 20 years, it claimed that Taliban are terrorists, which they may very well be terrorists. But at the same time, when it became clear that it cannot continue business as usual, it started negotiating with the same Taliban terrorists to reach an agreement to withdraw its forces and leave the government to Taliban. Okay, so it's not a question of whether Taliban is a bad regime or a good regime. It's a terrible regime. We all know that. But the US, with its intervention, has made things much worse, not better. That's the point.
Absolutely. Not absolutely. We have to discuss this in a different, in another episode, because this is such a huge topic to talk about. But as we wrap up tonight, I want to sincerely thank Professor Sahimi and Ambassador Limbert for sharing their time, insight, and candor with us today. Your perspectives helps us move beyond headlines and into the deeper structural and diplomatic realities shaping Iran's future. And to our viewers, thank you for joining us, for engaging thoughtfully, and for continuing to support serious, nuanced conversations on issues that truly matter. We'll continue to bring you rigorous analysis and diverse viewpoints. Until next time.